Today I'm going to show you how to change the alternator on a 1.2 VW engine, the 1.2 12 valve 3-cylinder. This one's fitted into a Polo, but this engine went into a whole range of VW Audi cars. This is my son's car, and yesterday while he was out at work he had the dreaded battery light of doom come on. We did test the alternator probably about 9 months ago, and it was okay. Luckily he's already had a new battery, but anyway, today we were able to pick up a second-hand one. Now, a necessary part of this job is to undo and remove the auxiliary drive belt, so I'll show you how to do that as well. So this is kind of two videos in one: how to change the alternator and how to do the auxiliary drive belt. I did confirm it was the alternator before we embarked on buying the second-hand one, which, as luck would have it, was at a breakers not very far away. I checked the voltage with the engine running at the battery, and it wouldn't raise the voltage above 12.2. With the engine stopped, I checked the continuity of the main battery lead to the back of the alternator and also the earth, and they were good, so thus confirming it is in fact the alternator. First step, open the battery lid and disconnect the battery with a 10mm spanner or socket. Negative first. Always negative first. It isn't strictly necessary to disconnect the positive, but I'm going to anyway, just for good measure. To help with ease of access, I'm also removing the air filter housing. It just opens the area up a little more so you can see better. Now, before we can even think about removing the alternator, we need to slacken the tensioner, which is this pulley here, to be able to remove the belt from the alternator here. There's a keyway, which is a T50 Torx, and that's where you need to lift up the tensioner. Unfortunately, on this car, that T50 Torx has been gnarled, and the Torx bit won't grip into it. I expect that that's a common problem because those tensioner arms are made of zinc casting, which is quite soft. An alternative way of doing it: if you pop the cap off the middle of the pulley, you'll see we expose a T50 Torx. With a T50 Torx bit on a ratchet, set the ratchet to undo and lift. And that will slacken off the belt. So lift with one hand, and with the other hand remove the belt from the alternator, and then gently let the tensioner back down. I'm not taking the belt all the way off today. The two bolts that you need to undo to get the alternator off the engine is that one there, and there's one there which is just the other side of the pulley from your perspective. But I hope you can see that this one is actually behind the tensioner pulley. So, as you can imagine, there's no way we can undo it and pull it out without moving the tensioner out of the way. To do that, with your T50 Torx, undo the long bolt that holds in the idler pulley, which is below the tensioner, and remove, and with a 16mm socket, undo the long bolt that holds the tensioner in and withdraw the tensioner. Now the dog can see the rabbit, or to be more precise, we can see the bottom and top bolts that hold the alternator in, and we've got plenty of clear space for getting them out. Now, with a 13mm socket, undo the lower and upper bolts that hold the alternator in. I've loosened the upper one off, but I suggest taking the lower one all the way out first. You may have noticed that when I've been removing all these parts with sockets, I've been using deep sockets, and you could of course use ordinary sockets with a very short extension bar. As you'll see, the bolt is quite long. If we look down the back of the alternator, you can see that there's a bracket with a stud on it. That stud fits into that hole there that's in the catalytic converter shield. On the other side of the shield, from behind as we're looking at it now, there's a small 8mm nut on that stud which you'll need to get off. It was impossible for me to film taking it off, but I managed to get it off with a little bit of contortion using a combination of a ratchet 8mm spanner and a 8mm wobble socket on a screwdriver bar. I'll link you to some suitable tools in the description below. And once the alternator is disconnected from the catalytic converter shield, undo the main power bolt with a 13mm socket and remove the main power cable. We'll also be able to get at the connection on the side of the alternator that powers the windings and provides the light on the dash. And finally, the bracket at the back of the alternator there is held to the alternator with a T25 Torx screw, and you need to undo that to release the bracket from the alternator, because the bracket also holds the cables. Hopefully you can see that that bracket is attached to the main power cable of the alternator. You can bet that when it comes to putting it all back together, I won't be reconnecting that to the alternator. And hey presto, the alternator is out. With the alternator out and the tensioner out, you can also more clearly see where the tensioner came out from. That's the hole that the bracket behind the alternator was attached to on the catalyst heat shield. When you took the alternator off, as you withdrew the bolt from the lower position, you may have found a spacer that dropped out and probably landed on the floor. That spacer goes here between the alternator lug and that surface of the block, and helps to hold the alternator at the correct position to make sure that the pulleys line up. So it's important that you rescue that, and it's important that you put it back. At the back of the alternator, there's little bosses in there which squeeze the bosses on the engine block. So to make sure that there's enough space for the bosses on the engine block to fit between the two, put the bolt through, leave about 5mm there. Bring the alternator into the area, make the electrical connections first. The main connection needs a 13mm socket to tighten down on the nut. Make sure that that's done up fairly tight. Don't want that coming undone when you're driving along. And don't forget the connector, which can only go on one way round. With the alternator offered into near position, put the bolt through the lower fixing hole and slip on the spacer behind it, so that you can then, as you're offering it up into position, you can hold this into place so that it doesn't fall away. And you can offer the upper bolt into position. And now you can tighten these screws fully, and that'll pull those bosses back into position. Now return the tensioner to position. You might find it easier to put your socket on the bolt in order to be able to get the bolt in. Make sure that you can put the bolt through there and screw it into the nutsert that's in the other lug easily by hand. I've just had to take this alternator back out to clean up one of the threads in there with a tap and die set, because we turn the tensioner back into position. It will only go in one way. Again, you'll need a deep socket, 16mm, just good and hand tight, or sufficient. Now return the idler pulley to position. T50 torques. Make sure that your tensioner and your idler pulley spin freely. Now's a good time to replace them if there's any problems with them. Look down by eye. Make sure that all the pulleys line up. I suggest that you do a little practice to make sure that you can pull on the tensioner okay. Now if you do find yourself taking the belt off completely, make sure that you mark the belt with a felt tip or something on the plain side, the direction of rotation, so that you can put it back the same way. It is not a good idea to reuse a belt and reverse its rotation direction. It will stress the belt in a different way to the way it was stressed originally, and that can lead to belt breakage. Another SID top tip is to take a photograph of the belt and its run on all the pulleys before you take it off, right back at the beginning of the job, so that you can refer back to that photo. Once you've got the belt in the right orientation, lift up the tensioner like I showed you earlier with the TX50, put the belt back round it and let the tensioner go. Obviously while you're doing that, make sure that all the ribs line up with all the pulleys, and whilst it's all disconnected and you've got it open, give your battery terminals and the top of your battery a clean, like I describe in the video I'm linking up above. Okay, reconnect the battery, positive first. You need your 10mm socket again. Tighten up the posts. Close the battery lid. Slip the airbox back into place. And the red light of doom has gone out. If, like me, you've used a second-hand alternator, then check the voltage that you're getting with the engine at idle, and I'm getting 14.4, so of course I'm very happy with that. With all the lights and the heated rear screen on, I'm still getting 14.15, 14.12, perfectly happy with that. And that's it. If you got some value from this video, give it a like, add your comments down below if you've got any experience that can help other people. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.